Hello, everyone. This is part 2 of session 8 of Pre-Socratics to Augustine, also called History of Philosophy 1. And it is the last recording on Plato's Euthyphro. We are now talking about a really famous puzzle, maybe the single most famous bit of Plato. It's called the Euthyphro Problem. And we saw that, in discussing disagreement and so on, we saw that in a sense there are a number of puzzling things. And the Euthyphro in the dialogue is kind of rightly famous for many of its discussions, but the Euthyphro problem is especially famous. And it is a kind of moment in the conversation when Euthyphro has put forward his third attempt at defining the pious. He said, with Socrates' help, revising it and so forth, they arrived at the following version of Euthyphro's third attempt, and that is that the pious is the god love. Setting aside disagreement, we are now kind of pretending that Euthyphro believes in gods, that there are at least some actions on which the gods that he believes in agree. So the pious is the god love. That is the proposal. And now Socrates gives him two options, and they are really tricky. The first option is that the pious is pious because it is God love. The second option is that the gods love the pious because it is pious. Now, Euthyphro does not understand these options or what they amount to, and there is a lot of elaboration of them. And that is a moment where you need to really read the text closely. The basic idea is that either pious is a feature that actions have independent of the attitudes of the gods. So an action just is pious. And that is why the gods love it. That's one of the options. The other option is that the gods have an attitude to some actions, and that attitude confers piety. By being God loved, an action becomes pious. And the distinction between those two ways of thinking about value properties is a kind of perennial distinction. It is today expressed in terms of realism and anti-realism, where the thought is that something is a kind of realist kind of value if it is independent of attitudes. So something just is good or is pious. And then, people either like it or not, but it's not as if approval or liking something or loving something makes it good or pious. And the other option is that attitudes confer properties. That, in our case where we discuss the pious, that the love of the gods confers the property piety. So the property is constituted by or dependent on these attitudes, and that type of theory is called anti-realism, where value is conferred by attitudes or dependent on attitudes, or as this is also sometimes put, mind-dependent. So the Euthyphro problem is so famous because that distinction seems to apply kind of to every kind of value. And in today's meta-ethics, people aren't so interested in piety. They are more interested just in goodness or in justice. But the distinction still is kind of applicable. You can either ask yourself whether value properties, normative properties, are dependent or independent on attitudes of approval. And that is one of the biggest questions in ethics. And hence, the Euthyphro problem is rightly incredibly famous. But the discussion in the Euthyphro, it relates immediately to those discussions today about realism and anti-realism, but it is a specific discussion about piety. And really what's going on is that Socrates wants to understand the difference between two properties, the relation between and the difference between two properties, namely the God-loved and the pious, because Euthyphro identifies that. When Euthyphro says, well, the pious is the God-loved, he kind of says piety and God-love, the pious and the God-love are identical. And Socrates' refutation of this idea works by showing that the pious and the God-love are two different kinds of properties. And this goes back to what we discussed last time, when the question was whether we ask, what is the pious versus how is the pious? And God-loved, Socrates says, is merely a quality of the pious, if at all. What does that mean? It means that when you think that something, when something is God-loved on account of the gods loving it, it comes to have this property by being affected a certain way or by standing in this relation where the gods pick it out and like it or love it. And so they make it God-loved. And Socrates compares this to non-normative properties like being carried. So you can imagine, let's say that, you want to move and the movers carry the sofa. So now the sofa is carried. And Socrates claims that carried is like God-loved. It is a property that is conferred by, something acting upon that which comes to have this property. And the claim is that pious isn't like this. Pious is not a property that something comes to have by standing in that kind of relation where something, relates to it in a certain way. Rather, pious is the kind of property that something simply has. Now, those are really complicated questions about sort of the metaphysics of different properties. The homework puzzle that I have for you, and that is a way of engaging with what's really special about Plato's ethics, is to think about the fact that Plato compares the property God love with non-normative properties like carried, led, and seen. You might think that is surprising because we are talking about a value property. God love is like, in one way or another, a good thing. But then here he compares it with non-normative features of the world that, you and your friends, you carry the sofa, or the bird spotter sees the bird. So the bird comes to have the property seen by someone spotting it. And the task for you is to come up with some kind of idea of why you think that Plato thinks that the property God loved isn't even fully a normative property, but more like a non-normative feature of the world, like carried, led, and seen.